Hello, history class. Let's go ahead and begin our review of the ancient Egypt reflection activities for this week. So looking at question number 1, compare and contrast, compare the natural environments of Mesopotamia and Egypt. What impacts did the environment have on the way society, culture, and religion developed in both locations? So we learned a lot last week about the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, how through use of irrigation in these river systems, the Mesopotamians were able to build these large stratified states, but that were very much reliant upon the water that the rivers would provide. Egypt, of course, is the same way. Egypt essentially is entirely arid, a very desert region, and the only thing that made the Egyptian civilization possible was the Nile River. That is provided pretty much all of the water they use to grow their crops, to drink, to feed their animals, and water their animals. And that without the Nile River, there would have been no Egyptian civilization. So, really looking at the way that both Mesopotamia and Egypt utilized their natural environments, very similar in this case. But of course, the rivers themselves were relatively different, which is interesting to see kind of the cascading effect that ends up having on Egyptian and Mesopotamian civilization. First of all, the Nile River, as a lot of you pointed out for this question, which was excellent, was very calm. Very predictable. Every year it would flood at about the same time. There would be a dry period at about the same time. And it really helped the Egyptians know exactly when to plant, when not to plant, where to plant, what time to harvest, and that the predictability of the Nile River really was beneficial to the Egyptians. And compare this to the very kind of chaotic rivers of the Tigris and the Euphrates, of course, having kind of their beginnings up in the Zagros mountain region, where you'd have these very large seasonal rains that would cause these sort of devastating floods to occur downriver in locations where the storm wouldn't have even been visible, wouldn't have even been able to be seen. So there's really no warning a lot of times when these absolutely devastating floods would hit places like Babylon and Mesopotamia, Uruk, and of course all those cities as well, and that in a lot of ways sort of typified their relationship with the rivers. Really kind of seeing them as of course, very necessary force, a life-giving force, but at the same point in time, a very cantankerous force, a force that could just as easily take life as it could give life. Also, if you look at the kind of broader scope of the natural environments, Egypt is a lot more geographically isolated than Mesopotamia is. Of course, if you look, they're pretty much surrounded by deserts on all sides. Then they have the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, having them into the north and to the east. The really only kind of point of contact would be downriver in the Nubia area. And of course, eventually it's time to go on through the Suez area or the Sinai Peninsula here. But that's not going to be until later. And generally, it's a lot harder for outside groups and outside people in order to get into Egypt. It meant that Egypt was a lot more sort of isolated than Mesopotamia was. Mesopotamia down here, I mean, you see just in this map here, we already have the development of all sorts of different kingdoms. You have the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Elamites, the Hittites, and that in a lot of ways, this contact helped, in a lot of ways, kind of flourish these civilizations, but in a lot of cases also was a liability because there was oftentimes a lot of warfare and a lot of hostility that seemed to make the life of Mesopotamians even more kind of precarious. The fact that they not only had to deal with a very kind of chaotic natural environment, the fact that there could be hostile neighboring peoples who could come in and attack at almost any point in time was also always present. So what were some of the impacts of this? Really, if you look at just kind of the perception and the mindset of the Egyptians versus the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians are a lot more positive, they're a lot more optimistic, they're a lot more upbeat, whereas the Mesopotamians seem like they are a lot more pessimistic and do not nearly have as kind of cheery outlook on life. And one of the areas that you really see this reflected, and of course this kind of gets to our document activity from this week, is in their religion. The fact that the Mesopotamian gods really weren't all that helpful or friendly to people. They were very powerful, and that is one of the reasons why the Mesopotamians felt that they still had to worship them and try to please them. But the gods weren't there for humans' benefits, by and large, for the most part. They were kind of sort of coexisting, and if the humans angered the gods, that is when the gods would kind of send these devastating floods to sort of, punish humanity. One story of the flood from the Epic of Gilgamesh, not the one that we read for document activity, but another version of it, put the reason for the gods sending the flood with the fact that the Mesopotamians, or the humans, so to speak, were just making too much noise. They were too noisy, and this upset the gods, so the gods decided to essentially kill all the humans so they'd stop being so darn noisy. And this really shows you the mindset of the Mesopotamians, that even the smallest thing that they could do might be enough to set the gods off and bring these devastating floods, as well as a whole litany of other disasters upon them. Whereas with Egypt, completely different story, right? If you remember from the Hymn of the Nile, they are heaping praise upon the river. They realize that the only reason that their very kind of vibrant society and culture is able to survive and flourish is because the benefits that the river give to them. The Mesopotamian, or the Egyptian gods, for the most part, are a lot more beneficial to humans. Of course, kind of the entire ruling philosophy of kind of this divine kingship model that Egypt has, where the pharaoh is essentially a living god, and his main job is essentially to preserve order and stability among human populations and among his human country or human culture, so that it's a much more kind of stabilizing philosophy as opposed to what you're looking at with Mesopotamian, which is so much more chaotic. So certainly the Mesopotamians fear their gods a lot more, whereas the Egyptians are much more willing to kind of praise their gods and feel like they're certainly on their side. So I think that's interesting to kind of look at this comparison between the two cultures and how much it really does come down to the impacts that their natural environments end up having on them. Overall, very good answers to this question. And let's dwell a little bit deeper into this idea of Ma'at, which was described this week, which I think really sort of plays out that idea of the stability inherent in Egypt's natural environment. With the idea of Ma'at, you see it really being directly translated into Egyptian culture for a large degree. The idea that they want to try to make human societies and the human world as orderly as their natural environment, and that's really kind of at the heart of Ma'at. The idea that you're supposed to be trying to promote and preserve order and harmony and stability. The fact that it really backs up the cyclical nature of Egyptian religion, where it's a very orderly process of life and death, and of the sun becoming the new pharaoh, the new god, the old god becoming essentially the old king becoming the god of the underworld, and how this is supposed to essentially kind of be cyclical, and there's always should be someone in place supporting the idea of Ma'at, that this was kind of the ruling ideology that the pharaohs were supposed to be maintaining, and that was preserving this idea of order and stability to kind of try to match this the natural environment that they found around them. So it's interesting how you see this link between the natural environment, this link with religion, this link with kingship. Of course, if kings were perceived to have not been maintaining Ma'at, that of course then would be where problems could eventually arise and come in, and the fact that was such kind of an important part of sort of the Egyptian ruling philosophy, I think it goes a long way to describing why the Egyptian culture was able to last for such a long period of time. Even within Mesopotamia, there's tons of different cities and kingdoms and empires that eventually rise and fall. But in Egypt, I mean, barring those sort of intermediate periods, you really have a much more stable line of a single kind of state system in place, And a large part of that is because of the natural stability of the environment, its relative isolation, and the idea that so much of their culture is based around the idea of preserving and emulating those sort of stabilizing factors within their culture and within their civilization. Alright, so let's talk a little bit more about the Great Pyramids. Why did the Egyptians build the pyramids? What role and function did the pyramids play? And based on what you learned this week, what explanation do you find most convincing for how the pyramids were constructed? So a lot of you also did a very good job of this. Really, of course, the purpose of the pyramids fit very much into the entire idea of their kind of religious philosophy. The fact that the soul of the king, his Ka, as it was called, was thought to essentially be the soul of a god, that it was an immortal soul, and that in order to kind of preserve that soul in the afterlife, allow the king to fulfill his duties to become essentially the new king of the dead and sort of keep this cyclical natural pattern going, that they needed to kind of have these monumental structures where it could house not just the king's Ka and his soul, but all the kind of worldly possessions that he was going to need to bring with him into the afterlife. So essentially that was the main purpose, and of course sort of I think human ego kind of plays into this, the fact that during the Old Kingdom pyramid the pharaohs were kind of trying to outdo themselves to get the largest, most impressive of these pyramids. Certainly plays a part. And of course, as time goes on, unfortunately for the pharaohs who were entombed in these pyramids, they kind of just become big billboards to grave robbers and tomb looters saying, "Loot here because there's a pharaoh buried here." So it's not a surprise that eventually, as time goes on, they stop this process and start going for much more subtler ways of burying their pharaohs. A lot of people point out a lot of good ideas surrounding the construction of the pyramids, from kind of the chipping and the extraction of the limestone blocks to their transportation on wooden rollers, to the potential use of mud and earthen ramps around the pyramid to try to haul these large blocks into place, potential use of cranes and other kind of engineering construction methods. So yeah, I thought for the most part, as long as everyone was watching the videos and picking up the hints, reading the textbook, and the PowerPoint, and relaying some of that information to me, you all did a very good job here. Here's another fun question that a lot of people took in some really interesting ways. What are some of the congratulations, you are now a time traveler, and you have the ability to go back in time and have a conversation with one historic individual from Egypt. Which historic figure would you choose? Why did you choose this particular Egyptian? And what questions would you like to ask your historic figure? And what else do you think you would talk about? And a lot of people did a really good job with this, going from trying to talk to King Narmer, the very first Egyptian king, or King Menes, to King Tut, the female pharaoh, Hatshepsut, or Nefertiti, was also brought up, as well as Ramses III, and Akhenaten as well. And I thought people did a really good job kind of explaining why they chose their various individuals, whether they were really interested in the fact that Egypt had these female rulers and these female pharaohs, or the fact that they wanted to know more about the Egyptian pyramids, or about Ramses' conquests, wanting to know more about Akhenaten and why he decided to try to essentially change the entire religious philosophy of Egypt, and why he wanted to try to shift to a more monotheistic religion. All of these were very good questions, and I thought that a lot of people brought up good ideas of other things that that they would like to talk about. Providing information to their historical figures about what life was like after their time period, what life is like today. Also some just kind of fun and interesting kind of get to know you questions too. So overall, I thought everyone did a very good job with question number 4, and I like a lot of the very interesting directions that you chose to take this question. So moving on to question number 5, list the main elements of the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms. Your 3 list should include the major themes, events, people, and achievements of each era. And once more, I thought people did a really good job of breaking these down and providing some pretty comprehensive lists as far as kind of the main elements of each. Of course, the Old Kingdom, you had the construction of the Great Pyramids, the formation of the idea of Ma'at, the time really of the most powerful pharaohs, where that kind of ruling ideology was really at its strongest. And I think a lot of what people typically think of when they think of kind of ancient Egypt, a lot of times they're thinking of that kind of old kingdom time period. With the Middle Kingdom, you of course have kind of a decline in power to a certain degree of the pharaohs, where a lot of times the idea of the pharaoh was being linked not so much with like divine power, but with a lot of responsibility. That idea of them having to maintain order and stability and ma'at throughout their kingdom was sort of seen as a more sort of heavy burden. A lot of times the pharaohs were not depicted as looking overly pleased or happy or cheerful. A lot of times they were kind of looked like they're sort of worn down to a certain degree. And also there was a rise in power of the priesthood, the exaltation of Ra or Amun-Ra eventually, and that there were certainly kind of challenges to the pharaoh's power in the Middle Kingdom that did not exist there in the Old Kingdom. You also see the democratization of the afterlife, the fact that now a lot more kind of people from that wealthy elite class were also being mummified in Egypt. It wasn't just reserved anymore for the pharaohs; they were also being entombed in very kind of lavish tombs as well. And also the construction of great temples was still occurring. So you still have, of course, that idea of kind of monumental architecture and monumental structure building, but this time it was certainly more focusing around the idea of kind of these large temples to oftentimes the gods such as Re or Ra, as opposed to the pharaoh himself. So certainly you can kind of tell even in their architecture that there's this power shift going on. With the New Kingdom, then, you see a transition to essentially really hidden tombs for the pharaohs. They don't want anyone to know. You have the kind of Valley of the Kings time period, where they're now sort of trying to make sure that the kings are going to be in hidden, secret locations, so tomb robbers and grave robbers can't get in and steal their, the objects that they're supposed to be taking with them to the afterlife and desecrate their tombs. You have the Amarna period going on, so a questioning of sort of traditional Egyptian religion. The capital is actually moved, and there's some disruption as far as that goes. But in a lot of ways, you also see the Egypt transferring into a much more of an expansionist state. The fact that they're going off into the rest of the Middle East, they're taking over Canaan, they're fighting with the Hittites, they're engaged in diplomacy and sort of an international system with the other Near East kingdoms. All this comes during the New Kingdom time period, and you really see Egypt kind of transitioning into sort of a world player, so to speak, and reaching out to a much larger degree than, for example, the Old Kingdom. So I thought those were kind of the main key points. Of course, some people brought in additional points on top of this, but I just kind of want to hit those few main ones for each of the various eras. Alright, that is it for the reflection activities. Once more, everyone did a good job. And if you have any questions about your grades or anything else, make sure to let me know. Alright, from there then, we are going to go ahead and hop on over to our document exercise. I know these are a little bit difficult at this point in time, kind of reading the language, trying to figure out exactly what they're saying, but I thought overall everyone did a pretty good job of this. So when we go through, take a look at the two documents and discuss some of the differences that you noticed between the Egyptians and how the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians perceived their natural environment, particularly the rivers. A lot of people use this very first quote out of the document on the Nile to kind of show the perspective the Egyptians had of the river. Hail thee, O Nile, who manifests thyself over this land and comes to give life to Egypt. Yeah, I think very simple, straight to the point. A lot of people point out that they thought that the Egyptians were worshiping the Nile almost like they would worship a god itself, which is, I would say, very, very true. Moving down to our next example here, you kind of see you create the grain, you bring forth the barley, assuring perpetuity of the temples. If you cease your toil and your work, then all that exists is in anguish. So once more showing all the kind of the benefits, what the river allows, and stating right off the bat that if you take that away, the human societies are not going to be doing great. And certainly the Egyptians recognized where all their prosperity was coming from. Another line here that some people used: he shines when he issues forth from the darkness to cause his flocks to prosper. It is his force that gives existence to all things. Once more, a great way to put it, showing the importance of the river. So pretty much all the depictions that you see of the river here in the Egyptian document are all very positive, right? It's life-giving, very beneficial to humans, making all things possible. And you can compare that then to really the kind of depictions that we have of water and flooding and the river system within the Mesopotamian document, within the Epic of Gilgamesh. The first line that some people point out was, in the morning, cakes darkness, and kind of darkness caking the sky. In the evening, a rain of wheat, real heaviness shower down. So pretty much the land becomes really dark. It begins raining incredibly heavy. And I saw the shape of the storm. The storm was terrifying to see. So sort of showing how, remember how a lot of these floods got started was storm systems sweeping over the plains into the mountains. There in the mountains, the rain would kind of create this flood system, which would then swash down. So kind of showing how seeing this process occur is pretty interesting here. And that's backed up in our next passage here. Like the battle force of the destructive Kashahu weapon passed over the people, kind of the flood weapon. No man could see his fellow, nor could he be distinguished from the sky. Even the gods were afraid of the flood weapon. How the flood kind of washed down, took everyone by surprise, and really kind of comparing the river here to a weapon that the gods are in fact using to punish humans. I don't believe it was the entire story was included in this version that I have in the document, but essentially the initial reason why the gods decide to punish humanity is because humans were making too much noise and the gods were having trouble to sleep, having trouble getting to sleep. So the head god decided to pretty much wipe out all humanity so they'd just be quiet with all their warfare and chattering and carrying on. So that there really, wasn't a real kind of strict moral reason why they were punishing the humans. It was more just because they were being inconvenient to the gods. And what's more sort of shows this really clear idea of how the gods have this very kind of fickle relationship with humans and just kind of turn on them on a whim. Very similar to how you see the storm come up very rapidly, right? And this anger is suddenly unleashed on the people without warning. The wind blew, the flood and tempest overwhelmed the land. When the seventh day arrived of the tempest, the flood and onslaught, which had struggled like women in labor, blew themselves out. So kind of showing this entire process of how the wind blew, the flood came up and rose up, and how all this then eventually blew itself over. So certainly showing a much more hectic and a much more kind of aggressive version of the river, and being used as a weapon against the people, not being the same sort of sustainer of life that you see in the Egyptian document. So how, for question number 2 then, does this impact Egyptian and Mesopotamian culture, and specifically how they perceive their gods? So very similar to how they perceive the rivers, the Egyptians here are portraying their gods in a very important and kind of beneficial way. Watering the orchards created by Re, or Ra, the sun god, to create all the cattle to live, you give the earth to drink, inexhaustible one. So saying that Re had this creating the orchards, creating positive and beneficial things. The next slide down here, if the gods suffer in heaven, then the faces of men waste away. So this link between how the gods are important and how when the gods suffer, humanity suffers as well. Moving down, the children Sobek and the sons of Nineth, the cycle of the gods which dwells in him and are prosperous. Once more kind of showing this idea of how much the cyclical nature of the gods is important to the Egyptians and how that's tied into the cyclical nature of the rivers themselves. And finally down here, men exalt him like the cycle of the gods. Once more this idea of the cycle. They dread him who creates the heat, pretty much the sun god Ra, even though he, Ra, has made his son Osiris the universal master in order to give prosperity to Egypt. Come and prosper, O Nile, come and prosper. So once more showing a much more kind of positive view of the gods themselves. And even though Re, the sun god, could have a kind of harsh connotation to him, and that people could dread kind of the heat that was coming down,
certainly the Nile River made all of that beneficial still, and kind of made it so that everyone could still prosper. Comparing that then to depictions of the gods. Right here, you kind of see the gods playing a direct role in this quote as far as bringing the storm and bringing the clouds and bringing the flood that ultimately ends up having these kind of devastating consequences, which you have been talking about. A black cloud came up from the base of the sky. Adad kept rumbling inside it. Kind of the thunder, right? This thunder god. Shalet and Hanish were marching ahead. March as the chamberlains over mountain and country, so once more beginning in the mountains and rushing down into the countryside. Ikaral pulled out the mooring poles, and Inerta marched on and made the weirs overflow. Pretty much the dams, things that were supposed to keep the water in check, were made to overflow and flood the nature. So pretty much saying right here, God by God, who is doing what in this process and how they are making this flood come down to the people. Nope, I think I misplaced that one. There we go. And of course, after this flood is up, Enlil comes down and kind of sees what happened and is ultimately furious that the flood did not actually kill all of humanity, kind of saying, what sort of life survived? No man should have lived through the destruction, saying he wanted to really kind of wipe out all humans, and was pretty dismayed here that one of them had managed to survive. Through the process of sacrifices, though, pretty much the gods are able to become appeased. Enlil is the one who is kind of the angry one, while Ea is the one who is trying to warn the humanity and benefit them, and pretty much talks Enlil into trying to find other ways to punish humans for the transgressions, particularly because remember it mentioned earlier how the gods themselves were actually afraid of the flood, which I think was a kind of a very interesting thing to put in here. This idea that even though the flood was a weapon imposed by the gods, it kind of got out of hand and out of control, and they had to run back up to heaven before it would destroy them as well. But instead of punishing people with the flood, which was so devastating, saying here, instead of imposing the flood, let a lion come to diminish the people. Instead of imposing a flood, let a wolf come to diminish the people. Instead of imposing a flood, let famine be imposed to lessen the land. Instead of your imposing the flood, let air rise up and savage the people, kind of these other angry people around the Mesopotamians. So really, just kind of trying to say that the flood was kind of viewed as such a devastating weapon, and trying to convince the gods themselves to find sort of these other ways to punish humanity. And it's kind of, sort of, it really gives a good viewpoint of the mentality of the Mesopotamians. Sort of right here, they're trying to pick their poison, right? Kind of saying we'd rather be eaten by lions and wolves, we'd rather succumb to famine, we'd rather have warfare with other people than actually have this flood let loose on us again. Sort of showing the mentality that they came through. But very different depiction of the gods within our second document here than what you saw in the exaltation of the Nile. So those are some of the main key points that you could have pointed out to make your arguments for the first few questions. The third question was very interesting. A lot of people took this in a lot of different directions. In kind of what ways the environment continues to affect civilization today. Some people made very good connotations as far as, look at the weather and the climate in Michigan, what can be grown, how does that affect, the way that we make our lives here today, as opposed to people who live in Florida, as people who live in California and warmer climates, or people who live in Arizona and more of a drier climate, how that still has quite a bit of effect on local economies and how people are living their lives. Some people brought up the idea and the issue of global warming, and saying that this environment still has a very big impact on our lives. Potentially, this could be coming much more to the forefront of people's kind of awareness of the environment and the impact that it has on civilizations, particularly if some of these very negative consequences that people are speculating about actually ultimately end up coming to fruition. And some people kind of look specifically at the Nile River from them until now, just kind of showing the how some of the issues are still kind of around the river today, pollution and things like that, and how people are still, though, kind of dependent and reliant upon a lot of these same environmental resources that we were very early on in the process of kind of the development of these large stratified states. We're still reliant upon them in very much kind of the same ways today. So that's the end of our week 3 review. Good job, everyone, and I'm looking forward to reading everything going into week 3, so or week 4. All right, thank you very much, and have a great rest of the week.